friends. Glad that you're joining us for yet another week of our walk through the Gospel of Matthew. I am outside for my third week in a row. It is really nice to be able to do this. I am trying to not make it look like a hostage video. I know it's just kind of a blank wall back here, but I just enjoy being out in it so much, and it's I don't know, kind of fun to be able to do these videos while being out in the middle of the neighborhood a little bit and seeing some of our neighbors and all this. I usually hang out on the porch for a couple hours before actually recording, so it gets opportunity to kind of talk with people as they walk through. So here we go. We're in chapter 23 tonight, and I'm going to do something that I have been hesitant to do along the way, and that is cover an entire chapter in one go. So it's a little bit longer reading for you when I tell you to pause here in a minute and do some reading, but we're going to look at all of chapter 23 tonight. It does roll together on purpose. It's meant to be read and heard kind of in chunk. And so I want to give you the opportunity to take it all in as a whole. There's a lot going on in this particular chapter, a lot of conversation for us to have as we kind of suss out some of what Jesus is talking about, because it's meaningful not just to his audience at the time. He's sparring with the Pharisees and the scribes, but it should be something for us to take note of for some obvious reasons that we'll get to as we work our way through. So what I want you to do right now is pause the video and go ahead and read through Matthew chapter 23. And when you have finished reading 23, go ahead and unpause it. And if you are an underliner, a highlighter, a note taker, what I want you to do as you work your way through chapter 23 is note what Jesus accuses the Pharisees and religious teachers, scribes, of doing. And I want you to me, so I don't actually know if this is going to get recorded or not. Waiting. Hit pause. And hypocrisy is the word that you probably noticed used over and over and over again as you worked your way through that chapter. That's the kind of key element here. But there are a couple of other things worth pointing out. One, the first thing that Jesus does is affirm the Pharisees' teaching. So notice, with all of the woe to you that comes after, we begin with Jesus affirming the teaching of the Pharisees. Their interest in keeping the law is not tossed out the door by Jesus. He says, practice and obey what they tell you, but don't follow their example. This is very much a do what they do what I say, not what I do, which was a great bit of wisdom coming from him particularly. But what Jesus is doing for his audience and what Matthew is doing for his first readers is really, especially as you read your way through, I hope you picked up on this, highlighting the difference between what leadership looked like in the mainstream Jewish community, especially after the destruction of the temple, when the Pharisees were the only surviving. It's about more than just what the Pharisees say. It's about the tendencies that we have to emulate power in our world. How easy it is for even early churches to adopt what they are used to as as how they are going to operate in their religious community. And what Jesus is saying over and over is their teaching is fine. They're highlighting the importance of God. All of that is great. But how they practice it is not a good example. So you have a different example to look to. And of course, in Matthew, over and over, we are reminded that Jesus is that example. Here in chapter 23, we see Jesus talking about why. What makes their leadership, their praxis, their practice of their faith, faulty. So he starts by saying everything is for show. It's about looking good. It's not about doing good. It's not about being a person shaped by God's heart or God's law. It is very much about looking good in the public eye. So they go out of their way to be noticed, whether that's with how large the box is that they bind to their forehead for prayer, or how long they wear it, or how long the tassels are on their cloaks, or when they wear them. Those are things that the law talks about being worn during, prayer specifically, and maybe as a metaphorical thing about binding them on your forehead and on your heart. So the tassels, the early church then had those traditions baked into them, and especially after the destruction of the temple, Jewish Christians still saw Pharisees as ties, and there's nothing bad about the system itself, but how it gets approached and taught, and then especially by those in leadership, how it gets wielded and used against other people is very much the problem. One of the things that Jesus highlights repeatedly is that they struggle to understand about how they pray. This is true about how blind guides leading the blind statement is apt for so many reasons. Is the one of importance that is in, verse 17? Blind fools, which is more important? The gold in the temple or the sacred space itself? So in order to not swear by the name of God, but still be able to take oaths in meaningful ways, something that Jesus has already addressed in the Sermon on the Mount, let your yes be yes and your no be no. The Pharisees came up with all of these systems to take oaths while not swearing by God or using God's name in vain. That would be the question. And for Jesus, what he's trying to highlight is there's vanity in that itself. Like, so you've decided that you're going to avoid this, and so now you can take an oath by the offerings, the sacrifices on the altar, but you can't swear by the altar itself. Like you've missed which of those is most valuable while creating the system that tries to keep everything square. And by trying to keep everything square, you've failed to understand the core principle of the law and of who God is and what God wants. So he starts with the statement that they're hypocrites and that everything that they do is for show. And he circles back around in the end of chapter 23 to talk about what that has looked like in practice. So after working his way through all of these different things where they, strain out gnats and swallow camels, two unclean creatures in Jewish tradition, one a far more obvious and visible creature than the other. Jesus uses that image to say you work so hard to get the tiny things, and yet somehow you are hucking down a giant camel as if it is nothing. And that comes to a failure to understand God and God's heart and who God is, period. And so by the end, we're to murder. So hypocrisy to murder all the way through there. And Jesus starts talking about the way that they've murdered the prophets in the past, and how the Pharisees say, oh, well, yeah, we would never, ever, ever do that, all while they are currently plotting Jesus' murder. And so that hypocrisy is their great downfall. And maybe the best way to frame up hypocrisy is an inability to see and understand ourselves. Very often in practice, what it looks like is giving ourselves a pass on stuff that we would never, ever give other people a pass on. In modern Christianity, it has taken more forms than I care to count. Some of the most obvious and painful are, not that far in our past. The church has been on the wrong side of a number of civil and cultural issues that have plagued us, especially in the South, but even in the North. During the civil rights movement, churches were very often in favor of the status quo or upholding segregation, and weren't very often on the front lines trying to get things changed. Obvious failure on our part. And yet, I think now sometimes we think, oh, we would never, ever do that again. Exactly like the Pharisees did in the first century, and exactly like Christians have done in every century between those two moments. And so I think as we read through chapter 23, as we look and pay attention to the ways hypocrisy is described, it is important for us to understand how we still perpetuate some of those same things. Because if we're not willing to see that, then we are in the exact same position that many of the Pharisees are in Jesus' view here. Voices of good action, but do not embody it. And there is little less holy than that. That is, in many ways, the very definition of taking the Lord's name in vain, to claim something, but not actually do anything. So, all right, I'm glad that you joined us this evening. We will take on chapter 24 next week, and look forward to finishing up Matthew sometime in the very near future. The sooner the better. There's more I want to get to, but I also don't want to just rush through Matthew because there's still, obviously, we're getting closer and closer to the crucifixion. Still a lot of very important stuff to talk about in this gospel. So, work our way through Matthew in the coming weeks, and then we have other stuff coming this summer, but we can talk more about that later. All right, thanks, y'all. Have a good one.